I am going to turn this over now to Aassia and remind everybody to please put their questions in the Q&A box throughout. Take it away.
Thank you so much, McLean, and so pleased to welcome you, Mandy and Frida, to this really interesting discussion. Miles and I are really looking forward to this conversation. I think it's going to be very meaningful, very rich, and something that should educate our audience on the phone as to how to think differently about DEI and how to plan for the future. So I'm going to kick it off with a little bit of story. In 2020, MBO made a commitment, which we call Opportunity for All. It was a commitment to increase awareness of diversity of business ownership inside the independent workforce and discuss the obstacles and challenges that owners face when they're trying to grow their 100% diversely owned firms. We started this journey with data. So we first surveyed, and we are actively analyzing the data that we collected on our population and intend to share it out. We committed to using our insights to build a business case and advocacy through the form of a campaign, which we call Opportunity for All. And we set ourselves an audacious goal. That goal was to increase diverse owner opportunity by 10,000 more within our client, partner, and individual ecosystems. The reason that I share this is that I'm very curious to understand, you are female founders, Miles, I'm curious to hear from you on this as well. What data or business case or advocacy drove the creation of each of your firms? What is your audacious goal? And I'd love to ask this question first of you, Frida, and then of you, Mandy.
That's a great question. I mean, I think that, an audacious goal that I have for the world at large is that, in this time of huge transformation, we really take the idea of equality seriously and start to really make meaningful movement in that direction, which I think will need to require some discomfort on the part of people who have been, sort of in advantaged positions to date. And, for us, a lot of that means really that people start to feel comfortable divulging diversity data that historically had been quite, and not even historically, but remains tightly guarded. And I think we can't make meaningful change in this area without more transparency. So my audacious goal is that we take equality seriously and start to produce transparent data so that we can all achieve that goal.
Wonderful. Mandy, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, no, thanks. So when we talk about some of the data, right, that allowed us or that drove us to do some of the advocacy work that we're doing, it was my own experiences, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit later. But when we talk about the data, it was looking at research from a lot of groups, Boston Consulting Group being one, saying that 97% of mid-size and large enterprises had formal diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, but 75% of the underrepresented professionals, that's women, that's people of color, that's LGBT, the way they've defined it, did not feel that they benefited from the programs at all. And so we knew that these programs, although enterprises were putting a lot of money behind them, that we weren't seeing the results that we would anticipate, given the funds and the effort that had been put behind the initiatives. And so really wanting to understand why were we not seeing success when there was so much effort, and starting to realize the approach and the way organizations were approaching these issues was really the reason why we weren't seeing that success. And so how should we really be analyzing, measuring, diagnosing diversity, equity, inclusion issues? I know Frida talked about, some of the reluctance to share some of the diversity goals, but I also think there's been too much of a focus on companies on just diversity. That the reason we haven't seen the increases that we would expect is because we've just now started to have this awareness around inclusion and equity, right? And so we see more organizations talking about belonging and inclusion and equity, and understanding that the individual interventions aren't the only things that we have to look at. We have to look at our system-wide approach as well, as far as how the organization is tackling these issues. So that is the data that really drove us to do this work. And when we think of our audacious goal, it's to create a workplace where everyone belongs, where we really are seeing equity within the workplace, that the workplace becomes the meritocracy that I think many people think it is, but we all know it's not, where everyone in all talent has a chance to really thrive within the workplace.
That's a great framework, and both of you have laid out really important and thoughtful objectives. What I want to do now is to pose a question to Miles that I think will be a really interesting way to take this conversation forward for our audience, much of which is a C-suite audience, right? And Miles, as a CEO yourself, when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, this great framework of belonging, how do you fit it into a data-driven, measurable, and actionable framework? You know, you've been a leader that has taken holistic global views of workforces, and you're also an expert on workforce transformation. What is the lens you bring to this conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Aassia. And thanks, Frida and Mandy, for joining today and for your commentary on the first question. You know, I guess I'm a pretty pragmatic kind of thinker and speaker. and so what I've seen for decades, it's obviously evolved in a good direction, but there's so much more progress that needs to be made. But for me, as a leader, I think about almost, I'm going to say, gauging the authenticity of leaders' commentary by looking at where they're actually having the most granular impact, because aggregate impact is merely an aggregation of individual impacts, right? And so at MBO, when I came to MBO, and Aassia, you and I talked about it a good bit, the question is, MBO has 150 to 200 employees, so we can influence it with that employee base. But our real ability to impact society is how we impact, over 50,000 independent solo entrepreneurs that have chosen to be independents. And are we doing everything that we can do to help advance diversity, equity, and inclusion at the very front coalface of the way the world is functioning and the world we operate in, right? So we're primarily a US business today. But so I could stand up and talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, but without having the metrics to say, well, how are we going to measure that? Like, so are we going to be able to help 100 diverse people have more equity and more inclusion? Or are we going to have it for 1,000? Which is why we got to the 10,000 number, which I think is an audacious goal given the size of our company. But having said that, we can very clearly measure whether we're actually having a direct impact. So, one of the things I run into today, and so there's diversity supplier objectives that people have. So the way you can address that, though, is you can go out and hire a firm that is owned by a minority or diverse person, but everybody employed by them could be non-diverse. And what I'm saying is we're trying to impact it at the most granular level. And I say that because every successful person that I've run into figures out how you measure in the tightest unit, smallest, most granular unit over the shortest time frame. And then they get good at doing that many, many, many times. And you wake up someday and you say, we actually had really demonstrable impact. And so in answering your question about what can leaders do, it's not just about the platitudes. It's about, to me, it's about what is the most granular action you're taking right now to advance more equity and inclusion of the diverse workforce. And so that's my authenticity point, is it's really only authentic when you're taking action that is actually making a difference today. Talking is easy.
It's a great point. And I think I'm going to sort of cue something, because I had a thought both for you, Mandy, and for you, Frida. Mandy, sorry, and for you, Frida, as I heard Miles speaking, which is each of you within your businesses solve a very small and specific problem using technology and a platform approach to effect change sort of one individual at a time, but it aggregates up to be something very meaningful. Mandy, could you speak a little bit about what it is that your platform does and how what Miles was describing might be something that you're achieving step by step through your listening tools for Kanarys?
Yeah, no, great question. So, what we see a lot of times is organizations want to do better, right? They want to move the needle on diversity, equity, inclusion, but they don't know how. And so a lot of times what we'll get is organizations coming to us saying, can you do an unconscious bias training? And what we try to do is change their mind frame, right, around these issues and around how we approach diversity, equity, inclusion. And I know Frida and I have talked about this before. There's a lot of research that shows unconscious bias training is not the way to approach these issues, and it actually can cause more harm. So the first thing we do when we're working with an organization is we help them diagnose the actual issues that exist within the organization. Having someone come and do an off-the-shelf training is not going to lead to impact within your organization. You have to have a prescription, a plan that's laid out for your organization that's going to ensure success within your organization. So when we work with companies, what we do is we help them diagnose the issues. So we do a workplace equity assessment, not only on their systems, so that we can understand how their talent acquisition, their performance management, the way their pay policies are working, whether those are perpetuating inequities within their workplace. And then we also do an assessment with their employees to understand the lived challenges that their employees are going through. So that's all done in a way where the employees are providing confidential information so they feel safe to provide that feedback. Once we have that, then we put together a precise recommendation plan for the company based off the data that we've seen. So that's the way we work with organizations, because we don't think just coming in and having someone do a speech or doing a training that really isn't hitting and honing in on the issues that your organization has is effective. And that's the reason why we haven't seen success when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, over the past few decades.
Can I share a slide? Is that okay? Because I have to just put the slide up. So, this is the problem. Okay, so I know I completely agree with what Mandy said. Inclusion is a huge problem. However, I just want to be super clear. The EOC makes disparate impact technically illegal. However, it is not illegal if a tool shows validity. Okay. And so I would say that basically, and you can see the numbers here in terms of, employers that are reporting the number of these, percentage of employers reporting the use of these tools. This is disparate impact. This is 80%. Show me one tool that passes disparate impact. Okay. And up to 70% of employers are using these tools. Okay. So unfortunately, hiring is still a massive problem. I mean, because, most employers are used, and by the way, human resume review doesn't meet disparate impact either, right? Because of unconscious bias. This is per audit studies that are done when you submit the same resume and you put John versus Jamal. So the point I'm trying to make, and look, there are new tools like pymetrics that come along and do better. And again, there are other tools as well. But the vast majority of tools that are currently in widespread use, right? This is tens of millions of people being evaluated by these procedures every year. This is not a small problem. This is a big component of why we don't have diverse workforces in this country, right? And so I think that, so again, how do we try to address this? I mean, we don't process tens or hundreds of millions of people. We process a few million. We ensure that our tool has a much better impact on, communities of color and women than any of the other tools that are commonly used. And we're actually supportive of legislation in a couple of municipalities right now that would basically say that all tools, all automated systems used in hiring need to report disparate impact. So disparate impact, for people that don't know, it means if you have 100 men applying and 100 women, how many men are you selecting and how many women are you selecting? And if the ratio falls below 80%, so if you're selecting 10 men But 5 women, that's a 0.5 ratio, that's a 50% ratio, that would fall below disparate impact. So again, I do think that like we have to address the hiring issue. It's not a small issue at all. Like automated systems are only becoming more prevalent, not less prevalent. And right now, the state of affairs is pretty abysmal. So,
wow. Well, this leads to a question that I was proposing to ask of you, Frida, and I think you've already partially.
And by the way, I didn't. Sorry, that slide is for a different presentation today.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Like I have to show this because I don't think people realize. People think disparate impact is illegal, and I'm like, not really. It's legal, right? I mean, if you can show that your tool then predicts performance, you can have a tool that doesn't select people fairly. But the problem is, if the people that you've trained it off of are a particular group, men, Caucasians, it will actually predict performance in those groups. So it's kind of like a never-ending cycle that you can't get out of, because it's like, oh well, this tool only selects white people, but oh, by the way, those white people do well, so it predicts performance, but it still leaves the remainder of the population kind of screwed. You know what I mean? So we have to get beyond this idea that like, that's a valid way of evaluating hiring tools. So sorry, I interrupted you.
Hey, Frida, can I ask Frida a question? So that slide that you put up is just on the selection. It doesn't factor in pay equality. Is that? Yeah. Okay. That's what that's how I was reading it. Yeah.
No, I mean, it just factors in selection. And then if you were to make a comparable slide for some of the other things like, promotion and this and that and the other, then just imagine that slide looks the same. Do you know what I mean? The reason it only focuses on hiring is just generally speaking, the automated tool is generally used in the hiring process, not so much in promotion, right? Promotion, you're going to have more of a manual process, right? So we focused on places where there was data in the literature to allow us to understand the impact that these automated processes are having, right? And then you get to what Mandy was talking about, that a lot of the stuff that happens inside a company is less about automation. It's more about the human inclusion piece of things. So
absolutely.
Yep. Thank you.
So one of the questions, and Mandy, this question I think I will pose to you. So we've talked about how to scale D&I. There's a piece about technology, about platforms, about data, but it's also a very human scale opportunity for companies. So what is a story of change and increase in opportunity that has been driven by your platform? So it becomes crisp and more real for people, what a platform can do to drive change.
Yeah, sure. And so I think it also helps to think of the use of technology in this way is becoming more prevalent, right? But it's still a new concept and a new idea for folks. And so a lot of the challenges we have is helping people to understand that technology can assist them, right? And so Frida obviously just hit on that, on some of the ways where the tools can help in the hiring process. But I think one of the challenges that many enterprises and organizations still struggle with is they think that kind of traditional D&I compliance or unconscious bias training is the only way to tackle those issues. And so I think what a lot of, some of my peers and counterparts are doing is trying to really help companies understand that we don't have to continue to operate with the status quo, that there are other ways, and that technology can actually help elevate those voices and help us to have more widespread change throughout our organization. And so this is what I mean when I talk about individual interventions. If we're talking about how do we train our staff up, right, which is needed, and I don't want to minimize that and think that that's not a part of the process, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. And what we've seen is organizations have struggled to understand that their organizational processes, the way the systems are operating, also perpetuate and cause these inequities. And so we have to attack it from both angles, where we're looking at our systems and we are equipping our employees with the tools that they need as well, right, to ensure that they are aware of bias, that everyone has bias, and tackling that from both ends. So what we've seen from success from our clients, right, is, when we look at annual engagement surveys, which is what most people use, that does not address DI issues most of the time. You'll usually see a handful of DI questions, but you don't really get a sense of how underrepresented populations are struggling and the day-to-day issues that they have within the workplace. And so what we're able to do is help bring those issues to the forefront, help them put in place strategies around that to actually deal with those issues. And what we see, like I said, is that a lot of the interventions that we recommend are going to be different for those different population groups. We look at everything through an intersectionality lens. It's going to also be different for different departments and locations. And so I think just like we have very honed and specific techniques on the way we deploy marketing and look at our digital media and sales and things like that, we have to think of DEI the same, that it's not something that we can just do once a year where we bring in someone to train, that we have to ensure that we have a long-term strategy and we're measuring the effectiveness of that strategy.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm actually curious, Mandy, if I can ask you, make a comment and ask a question. So I totally agree that, like, you know, it's back to, you know, again, as a cognitive scientist, I always say we have to change our systems, not our brains, because our brains, unfortunately, are not very good at being changed. Let's put it that way. Whereas our systems, we have more hope, right? So I completely agree with you. Can you give me an example of like a system that, for example, perpetuates lack of inclusion? Because I'd love to, I don't know the space nearly as well as, you know, hiring, for example.
Yeah, so I won't hit on hiring because I know you know that, but there's lots of things in hiring, right? Just
Sure.
You know, the way job descriptions are put together, all of those.
100%. Yeah.
And I think that even on that front, right, we're
Sure.
still educating folks, because I can't tell you how many companies I've talked to that just think, what do you mean? We just put out a job description. How is that discriminatory? You know? Yeah. But then they talk about how they have pipeline issues, and we know it's because of the way that their entire talent acquisition process is put together.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, the same systems replicate. So let me give you another example, and we've started to see legislation around this, right? The way companies do their pay practices, right, also perpetuate a lot of the disparities that we see. So when we look at pay should not be based off someone's previous salary history, right? Because we have disparities within society. It should be based off the job itself. But we continue to see a lot of companies make pay decisions and salaries based off someone's previous pay history. And so those are the types of things when we talk about the systems, the way their organizations operating, that we do those analysis and help them understand how they really should be structured to ensure that they're not perpetuating these inequities.
And we have this concept of we call it the bias mitigation tech stack, or the diversity tech stack, but essentially where they're, you know, so for example, you name two areas, right? Writing job descriptions and pay equity. So Textio, shout out to Textio, helps you with your job description. Syndio, if you have heard or have not heard of Syndio, is a pay equity platform. So I do think that, like, and I'm sure there are others that we haven't even mentioned here in terms of like things that can help. But I mean, I think it goes back to this idea that I think technologists, you know, at least the ones I know, are actively building technology that can help bias mitigate these systems. So I think we have to, again, Aassia, I mean, you know, I think we have to move outside of thinking like, oh, if we just change enough people's minds, bang on the table loud enough, like we're going to fix something, because that's just not, I don't think how, like, think of any other thing you want to change in life. You have transparency around the metrics, you have accountability, you know the goals you're shooting for, and so on. So anyways, thanks for that clarification, Mandy.
So one of the questions I have is, because I'm curious and fascinated by the fact that both of your companies, and this is true of MBO as well, so I think it's something that we share that our audience might not understand that we share, which is that each of us is working on workforce transformation. Each of us is using a platform-based, technology-based approach, and then we're using new and innovative tools like AI. And so I want to speak specifically to systemic change or DEI. At one level, it happens on a human, person by person level, but on another level, you make the greatest impact when you change the system. So let's speak about how each of you, and for all three panelists, have done that, have used systemic tools to make transformational change. Who'd like to go first? Frida, do you want to? Or Miles, how about you?
Either way, I'm happy to go first. Sometimes it's the things you don't do. It's just kind of interesting. And since I got to MBO, we did an expansive research on the quality of matching. So AI matching, of people to job wrecks, et cetera. And when you step back and you put the DEI lens on it, you say, well, let me think about this. If I'm training my AI engine based on historical data and historical human judgment, now I can be biased at scale. It actually can have a very important unintended consequence. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that, me and our data scientists, right? Because when I dug into it, it's well, how do you know you're going to get the best candidate? And the way you disposition the match is you ask a recruiter, would have you matched these 3 people or not? And they tell you, and then you say, well, they should match. But by definition, you have unconscious bias in that process. Okay, so we haven't deployed any AI on matching. Okay, and so we apply it to what I'll say structured mechanical decisions, but not on who to match to a job. And so I just highlight that because I think a lot of the way that AI gets deployed is the way I just described it. I'm not saying all of it does, but a lot of AI gets deployed by how do I disposition a human judgment? So when you're using it to make decisions about humans, you really got to be careful for the unconscious bias that comes in from, it's an unintended consequence is what I'm saying.
Yep. And actually, can I just riff off of that? Because there's also a question in the chat saying, how do you counter bias in algorithmic hiring? So, I mean, I can speak to, some of the practices we use and we've seen others use. So the first thing that you're talking about, you're absolutely right. To some extent, you are mirroring human decision-making. Now, I don't think all of human decision-making is bad. I just think parts of it are bad, right? It's a little bit like system 1 and 2 thinking. The system 1 thinking is the unconscious bias. The system 2 is sort of more this thoughtful part. So how do you mitigate bias in algorithms given what you just said? So I think the first thing, and we do this and other platforms do this, is you look for proxy variables in your data, right? So what that means is that whatever data you're using to make the prediction, if one or more of your variables are tightly correlated with race or gender, you have a problem, right? It's very challenging to then use that data in your algorithm. And so that's one thing that pymetrics solves by, we don't look at resumes, we look at what we call soft skills, cognitive, social, and emotional aptitudes. And it's not like they have no proxy variables, they have very few and they're very small, not very correlated, as opposed to a lot of resume data it's rife with proxy variables because women play different sports, join different organizations, so do people of color, I mean, yada, yada, right? So that is a huge thing. You have to interrogate your data, look at are there proxy variables and try to eliminate that as much as possible. And then the second piece is you can actually test. I mean, this is what's great about algorithms if you build them this way. Unlike human decisions, you can actually test your algorithm and say, are you discriminating? Do you have statistical differences in your match rates for different people, right? And so we took the position early on that we were not going to release any algorithms that didn't have statistical parity between groups, right? And again, that's pretty unique. Not many folks are doing that. I think that's unwise. I think you should be doing that, but that's the other way. Unlike, you unleash Frida Polli on society and you cannot test my brain. Right. And not only that, you can't fix my brain. Even if you determine it's not, treating people fairly, you can't be like, oh, let's just get in there with a scalpel and do something about it. So those are the two ways that we and others, I think, who are very creating sort of what we call fairness optimized artificial intelligence. Those are two critical components. So.
Mandy, do you have any components of AI or other kind of algorithmic pieces to how your listening platform works for employee well-being? I'm really curious about how tech fits into your solution.
Yeah, so a lot of our assessments that we do with the employees, we do have natural language processing, some other things that we built into to really get a better sense of what's going on with the employees with respect to their opportunities that exist and lived experiences there within the workplace. One of the things that's really important, especially with underrepresented groups, right, is that we're able to kind of bubble that to the top. And unfortunately, sometimes people are not just aggregating the data in a way where they can really understand what's going on. And so we view the work that we're doing, especially those long-term feedback loops where we're providing that safe way, as critical to ensure that individuals that may be the only in their workplace, right, or have such low numbers, are able to really express what's going on, and so that we can identify the obstacles that they're having throughout the employee life cycle, so that we can help the organizations really address those from a systems-based approach. And so again, we think it's both as critical, that we have to look at the systems, we have to create a way for employees to provide that feedback so we actually know the true challenges that exist, because a lot of the times we're guessing what we think are the challenges, when we really need to be looking at the data to tell us where the challenges exist for the employees, and using that to drive our strategy and the recommendations that we advise the companies to change within their systems and the structures and the policies and the culture, right, of their organization as well, in order to ensure that they're creating that inclusive and equitable work environment.
That's fascinating. And I think it kind of leads into an issue that is one that we've talked about a lot inside MBO as we think about the broader community that we serve. You know, Miles mentioned this, that there's your core employee base, and then there's all those people that you interact with. And for MBO, that's a massive community of providers that are these individual business owners. And so when we talk about well-being, we take a really broad view, sort of a workforce well-being that I think goes beyond maybe what companies have traditionally measured for. So they've measured for employee well-being, but in fact, there's a multiple set of stakeholders that they interact with. And, you know, in our data through State of Independence that McLean mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we have been tracking independent work for more than 10 years. And, you know, our data shows that 1 in 2 of the members of our workforce will be outside of the traditional walls of an employer, but be a contributor either as an owner or a freelancer in the very near future. If not, we're not already quite close to that, that turn point. So how do we measure well-being in this kind of an extended workforce? And what do you each feel, and the question is for each of you, is the right methodology to have that belonging, you know, as you measure in a broader way?
Can I speak first? Because I am not an expert. Therefore, what I'm going to say on this is I have no idea, and I would love to learn from people on this panel that are experts. Because and Mandy, I'm looking at you because I think it's a great point, and I that's not a subject we have any expertise in. So I'd love to learn from others who hopefully know.
Yeah, no. So we do measure inclusion and belonging within our platform. That's one of the things we do. When you know, inclusion and belonging we have to hear that from the employees, right? So when we look at equity, we can look at more systems, right? Because we can look to see if systems are equitable. But that comes from employees, and that's where we talk about where a lot of the annual engagement surveys really miss the mark, right? As far as really knowing which questions to ask, really understanding how to diagnose these issues. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, absolutely well-being is part of that. You could not feel included if you do not have psychological safety, if you do not feel like you belong within the organization, if you do not feel that you are valued. And so all of those things are very important and definitely go into creating inclusion in that atmosphere of psychological belonging and safety within an organization. So that is something absolutely we look at and work with organizations and measure and assess. And we measure and assess it not just in a broad base saying this is what we see within your organization. In order for any of these things to be implemented and to be taken out of the idea that this is only HR's job, we have metrics that help to track this within divisions, departments, who people are reporting to, so that ownership can be taken by you know, those respective individuals, and they have metrics that they can work against.
And can you give an example of like some questions or surveys or whatever you've developed to measure to get at that inclusion and psychological safety? I'm just curious.
I have to try to think off the top of my head. I mean, we have over 250 DEI questions that roll up into these various categories. And so there's many things that we look at when we're measuring inclusion and belonging.
Great. Okay.
So I'm going to be less sophisticated than Mandy, but early on in my career, I was fortunate to come across the founder of Select Research Institute, which ultimately bought Gallup. So everyone thinks of Gallup as a polling company.
Yep.
They actually have massive amounts of data on human behavior. And so I was fortunate to talk to a gentleman, Don Clifton, who was the founder. And he gave me advice, and he said, you'll be more successful, Miles, if you always think of the inverse question to what everybody else is asking in the room. He said, for example, people do exit surveys and they ask people why they are leaving. He goes, we focused on asking people why they stay. And the number one reason that people will stay at a company is not complicated. It's because they have friends. It's not about pay. And so today we're calling it inclusion. This is 25 years ago. We're calling it inclusion. But he said, if you look around with the people you're working with, see who has a friend and who doesn't. And I'm telling you, the people that don't have friends will leave. And it's very basic, but it's also, I'll just say over my 30 years, he's right. There's a lot of merit in his statement. And then to switch gears, one of the, maybe it relates more to the last question, Aassia, but most companies will talk about DEI, but one of the first things they do when they hire employees is they put training in place, practices in place, et cetera, to make the employee base more homogeneous. They give them training on methods. They give them training on the policy, on the way. In other words, I would submit that there's not enough celebration and encouragement of being heterogeneous. Mm-hmm. Because diversity inclusion is not that I have to be like Mandy and Frida or that they need to be like me. It's that we're embracing and celebrating the differences that we have and we leverage them to our advantage. And I think some of the systems and companies are trying to drive out the heterogeneous nature of people and make them more homogeneous. And so that's something that can systemically be addressed as well.
That's a really thoughtful point, and it kind of leads me to this conversation I know we've had repeatedly inside MBO, given that we deal with individuals that are creating project-based outcomes, which is the thing that you can measure that is unbiased is the outcome, right?
The outcome.
How you get there is where the biases sort of come into it, meaning, okay, you're only allowed to arrive at this outcome using these three methods that I feel comfortable with as a manager, which is where the heterogeneity versus homogeneous approach comes in. If we were to remove that set of assumptions about how you receive the outcome and say, it really doesn't matter how you receive the outcome, as long as the outcome is something that is good for business, good for the company, we shouldn't care how you got there, right? And that then allows a lot of different contributors to come to the table. And I know, Frida, you and I talked about this in our podcast on State of Independence, and I was fascinated with some of the science behind how you do this, which is really the gamification of how you discover who's going to be successful, right? And when you don't have a bias to what is a person's name, what is the color of their skin, where did they go to school, you could suddenly find that somebody is a perfect fit for a business challenge that you would have never picked them for. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think you're just talking about the value of soft skills, right? So I think, soft skills being sort of social, emotional, and cognitive aspects of human beings that, I think historically we've thought of them as, sort of intangible and not being able to be measured. And, I think modern science, says, no, that's not true. We can measure them. They are objective data points that you can use. And I think, it really allows people to understand their workforce holistically. I think that, unfortunately, because a resume is so easy to produce, or now LinkedIn or whatever, we've really over-indexed on that. And again, that's a backward-facing document, doesn't tell you anything about what somebody's potential is, what they could do in the future. And again, as we've mentioned before, unfortunately, resumes are rife with proxy variables versus soft skills are equally distributed, right? I mean, men and women have the same soft skill profile, people of different racial groups. So I think that, and to your point, it helps people discover things they would have never known otherwise, right? We have this great case study coming out of some reskilling work that we're doing with the state of Ohio, where there was a woman who had been sort of in live events, customer service for a long time, not even customer service, but like, sort of beverage stand kind of thing. Became homeless because of the pandemic, was a mother of two, went through a reskilling platform that, the first step was, pymetrics, and got recommended for a career in healthcare. And now she's, successfully employed in that career, even though she had no experience and had never sort of crossed her mind that's something that she could do. But that just goes to show that, if you're using something that is an equitable measurement system, and it's forward and it's future facing, you can discover, so much about individuals that you wouldn't know otherwise. And that's really powerful,
That's a great story. And I enjoyed hearing that story when we kind of went into it earlier on the podcast. So we're about 10 minutes out from where we're going to sort of start to wrap up. I know both of you are busy founders that need to get to your next customer meeting. And I love that. Celebrate the fact that you're both such successful young mothers and female founders. I mean, as somebody who's launched a startup or two in the past myself, I really believe that that's very important to change. But I do want to leave some time. I bet you that there are going to be some really interesting questions from our audience. And we have an audience very diverse, a lot of people within the supplier diversity landscape, C-suite executives, those that run workforce transformation programs. I'd love to give them a chance to pose questions to you. And McLean, if there's any that we want to address, would love to hear them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, ladies, both, and Miles, of course, for your insights today. This has been really, really illuminating. So we do have one intro question here that I want to tee up. We touched on it a little bit, but you guys have mentioned the data, and I'm going to read the whole question because I do think it offers some context. The question reads, employees from marginalized communities are often hired at lower salaries and then given lower pay bumps. Money and salary is often considered an impolite discussion, but it's the lack of discussion that perpetuates discrimination. So the speaker is curious as to how you use salary and pay band data to ensure equity and parity within your organizations, and then asks, do you set goals for transparency in this area? So I would like to, posit that both to Mandy and to Frida, and then Miles, ask you to weigh in, talking about how we can think about this in the contingent workforce. So Mandy, you want to get started?
Yeah, sure. I know when we were speaking earlier about some examples, right? This is another one that we flag when we're doing the systems assessments of not only not basing salary off someone's previous salary history, but we also flag disclosing pay bands, right? Usually folks have different kind of bands within, director level, senior VP, as far as what is the pay range for these different job descriptions. And that's something that we tell folks and organizations that we're working with that should be disclosed, because as the person that posed the question and noted, if you don't know, right, what the pay range is, how do you know if you are outside and if you're not being paid fairly? So this is one of the systems-based recommendations that we also make, is that these things should be disclosed, right? You're not disclosing or giving up someone's private salary information. You're just saying this is the range for people within this position, this kind of level within the organization. This is what their pay is. Now, I know the question also asks internally, like, what are we doing within our organizations? And we have very clear guidelines on not only just equity compensation, right, but with monetary compensation as well, to ensure that the equity and the monetary compensation we're paying folks is fair, and that we're not creating these pay disparities. So I'll turn it over to Frida, but yes, we do recommend that all organizations disclose this information for the pay bands and to set goals as well.
I don't really have anything to add. We do have similar practices, and I think those are best practices.
Excellent. Thank you to both. Miles, do you have anything you'd like to add to this one? Miles, you're on mute.
Oh, and that was so good. No, I said I don't have a lot to add. What we recently went to pay bands at MBO, right? And so our next step is to disclose those to the employee base, and then use those obviously in a hiring process. But I will say that we're not really a large company. It takes a lot of thoughtful process to come up with the pay bands, because you also want those pay bands to mean something and be done right. So I'm a big supporter of that. It came from a place that we were maniacal about it. And so I support that. and I think as it relates to the independence, because that's what you're asking about as well,
Yes.
Aassia, you know, the way that we're contributing to it with independence is there's transparency on the, basically on the pay for the job before anyone says they're interested in pursuing it. And that's regardless of, you know, any kind of race or gender, any other, you know, assessment of the person. So I think the independent workforce, just the way it's structured and working on a platform like that, the platforms create transparency, and that transparency is good for everyone involved.
Great, thank you so much.
Can I just say one other thing? Because the question also talked about the impoliteness, right? And I know that we sometimes hear this kind of fallacy that women don't negotiate, which is not true, right? There's been so much research that shows women do negotiate when it comes to salary, but women are penalized in a way that men are when they negotiate their salary. So I think it's so important, again, that we have these best practices, these systems in place so that we can guard against the, again, human bias that enters into the system.
Excellent. So last question is a quick lightning round, which it would be for each of you. What is one actionable thing that people can do on the phone today to make an impact as it relates to DEI initiatives, either existing or hopefully to be soon in place at their own company? And I'm going to start with you, Frida, because you're on the far end of my screen.
Sure. Just get data. Whatever DEI question you have, if you don't have the data, it's going to be really, really hard to have an answer.
Thank you. Mandy?
I would say to be courageous. So many people are afraid to get the data, as Frida said, to really understand what's going on. And I would encourage people to be more courageous with respect to these issues. These issues exist within your workplace, whether you want to delve into them or not. And so I think it's so much more important to really understand what's going on so you can solve the issues and get ahead of them, as opposed to kind of continue to kind of walk in the mind frame of this doesn't exist, or I don't really want to bring these issues to the forefront.
Well, and I really love your point too about going beyond simply doing an unconscious bias training. I think you guys are both hitting hard on solutions that feel more actionable. What about yourself, Miles?
So I won't repeat the data point, the two incremental ones. One is what I talked about earlier, is identifying the incremental, very specific steps you can take that are granular in terms of seeing observability. Because I think as company leaders, you need that to hit the second point, which is you need to be authentic and genuine in what you're doing here. And the platitudes at the top actually can serve a disservice if you're not executing in your own authentic way. And the authenticity starts with each of us individually, not telling a bunch of other people to be authentic. And so start with thyself.
Very good piece of advice. Aassia, anything you'd like to add before we wrap?
Absolutely. So certainly a question close to my heart as I've been working with Miles and the broader team at MBO. We have so many people inside our company with such heart for doing something good. And I truly appreciate that a group of people have come together of all backgrounds, all genders, all races to try to make change. And I think what we've learned is that one, you need to be comfortable getting a little uncomfortable as you identify champions. And it was uncomfortable for me to step forward to try to start a conversation. It's risky, right? Where you move outside of your comfort zone. It's not my job title. I don't run DEI for MBO. I am a vice president of marketing, and my core job is just to do great work for our talent. But I heard something, and I appreciated that the organization sponsored that journey as first and foremost a listening journey with our clients. We did not come forward with a packaged solution. We came forward with an opportunity and a challenge that they could participate in, and we've been learning from them ever since. So we've sat down with many of our enterprise clients, and we've just listened to what they're struggling with. Okay, how do I think about this? What can I do differently? How can I measure? And I think that is this very humbling part of this, is what you learn when you start listening to the market. And that is one of the reasons I was so excited to invite both of you to this conversation, because it just increases how we listen and learn from each other. And the second thing is, get uncomfortable. The concept of data is at the center of this. Get uncomfortable with, or get comfortable with, sharing out uncomfortable data. So if we have discovered something that isn't where we want to be 10 years from now, that's okay. Share it out and sort of ask your community why. Why, for example, is it hard for an independent business owner to be successful with a large firm? We actually learned very quickly the answer, which is it's really hard to get certified as a solo supplier. And that's something MBO can do something about. We're experts at getting, individuals to go work with very large firms. It's a problem we could solve, but we first had to understand that that was a problem. And so I think that is what I would leave us with, which is we continue to really listen to our constituents and then come forward with something that is something we're good at, right? So not platitudes, to Mel's point, but something we can actually do with technology at scale to make change. So thank you, McLean, for putting this together. This was great.
Of course. Well, thank you, Mandy. Thank you, Frida. Thank you, Miles, Aassia, for joining us today. Everybody, I hope you enjoyed the panel. We will send out the recording afterwards. And please do join us on April 8th for our panel on direct sourcing in the future of work, which will be our next topic coming up. So have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.